Thank you for your interest in the Welcome Johnny and Jane Home project. The project consists very simply of this: a veteran from any war and a non-veteran sit in a quiet room of their own. The non-veteran listener speaks an initial sentence to start the session, and then the veteran speaks as they wish and is silent as they wish, with the listener truly speaking not a word, but listening with 100% of their attention and their whole heart. The listener is offering the veteran the gift of the time and space to say whatever they wish about their experiences in the military, at war, and or going through the often difficult process of trying truly to come home. The average session tends to run between 1.5 and 3 hours. The listener speaks one more sentence well into the session. On this video, I'm going to tell you the 2 sentences the listener speaks. Before we begin with the most frequently asked questions that listeners bring up, I'd like you to listen to what Henri Nouwen says about listening. He says, "To listen is very hard because it asks of us so much interior stability that we no longer need to prove ourselves by speeches, arguments, statements, or declarations. True listeners no longer have an inner need to make their presence known. They are free to receive, welcome, to accept." He says listening is much more than allowing another to talk while waiting for a chance to respond. Listening is paying full attention to others and welcoming them into our very beings. The beauty of listening is that those who are listened to start feeling accepted, start taking their own words more seriously and discovering their true selves. Listening is a form of spiritual hospitality by which you invite strangers to become friends, to get to know their inner selves more fully, and even to dare to be silent with you. Now let's begin with the first questions that people ask.
Does this listening really make a difference?
It's really sad that in our culture, we've forgotten what I call the astonishing power of listening. We asked the veterans just a couple of questions. We said, what if anything was good about this for you? And what if anything was bad or negative? Every single one said something to the effect that they've never been given a chance to just say whatever they wanted to say, not be interviewed, not have anybody making comments. They knew the person wasn't sitting there thinking, how am I going to diagnose them, or fitting them into some theory. That person who was listening was just a member of the wider community.
What kind of training will I get as a volunteer?
Well, you don't really need much. A lot of people like to read chapter 6 of my book, When Johnny and Jane Come Marching Home, How All of Us Can Help Veterans, because that's about the interviews. But part of it, I'm just showing documentation through research that listening helps, that listening done by non-therapists helps. We call it social support when we do research on that. Some people like to have a discussion with a group of people who are going to be doing listening sessions ahead of time. And then there are 2 sentences that I'm going to give you later in the video. And one of those you speak at the very beginning of the session, and then one you speak most of the way through. And that's really about it, because truthfully, the main thing you need to learn is you really are not going to speak, but you're going to listen.
Will it matter if my politics are different from the vet I'm listening to?
Well, it may surprise you, but no, it doesn't matter in the least. It surprised me. And the reason is that once you start just listening and you focus on listening, the veteran's honesty and the integrity is so striking and so moving. And when you ask yourself, why does it feel sacred? It's because of that honesty and because of that integrity. And so whether what they believe about war in general or a particular war is the same thing as what you believe, it comes not to matter. What matters is that this is the story of a human being, and you're in the same room and you're listening to them.
Should I research beforehand about the military?
You don't need to do any research beforehand, because let me remind you again, your job is just to listen. It's not to have any expertise. It's not to know anything ahead of time. Of course, if you want to, it's perfectly fine. But you're not going to use that information in the sense that you'll be jumping in, making comments, or letting the veteran know that you know what these terms mean.
How do I get started? Should I introduce myself at the beginning?
You begin by saying your name, if you wish, and then here is the first sentence that you speak. As an American whose government sent you to war, I take some responsibility for what you experienced there and how it's been for you trying to come home. And if you want to talk, I will listen for as long as you wish to speak, and I will not judge.
What do I do if it's hard to get the vet to start talking?
Well, about 95% of the time, once you speak that first sentence, they start talking. Occasionally they'll say, you mean you're not going to interview me? You're not going to ask me questions? And then you just say no. And that's usually enough. Sometimes there will be a silence while they really register that there isn't anything in particular they need to do or are expected to do. And that silence is fine, and you just wait.
What if I say the wrong thing?
You won't say the wrong thing because you won't be speaking. It's amazing to see how people who are doing the listening, we're so used to feeling like we have to be ready to say something, we have to keep the conversation going, we have to make comments. But it's really very liberating for the listener if they take seriously the instruction that you are there just to listen. And listening takes everything you've got. If you listen, as we say, with 100% of your attention and with your whole heart, and you're keeping in mind that the reason you're doing that is because that's how you give the veteran the gift of this time and space.
What should I do if the vet stops talking or takes really long pauses?
First of all, just try to relax. Focus on the goal of allowing the veteran to speak or not to speak when they wish. And then focus on your job of remaining silent and completely attentive so that they continue to know they have permission to speak or be silent as they need to.
What do I do if I feel uncomfortable, sad, or otherwise upset by the things I'm hearing?
Well, don't run from those feelings. Do take note of them, but keep your focus on this. My job here is to listen, to give this person the gift of the time and space to do whatever they need to do.
What if I start crying?
Depending on what you hear, that is probably a very natural reaction. And in fact, it's a part of sharing the veteran's burden, which they've often carried for a long time in what is very often soul-crushing isolation. So there's nothing wrong with having them see you tear up. Just focus on the fact that the purpose of the session is to be a gift to the veteran. So even if you're crying, if you concentrate on silently receiving what the veteran is saying, it'll be clear to the veteran that your listening is the main priority, even if you're crying. If the veteran offers to stop speaking, just try smiling and shaking your head, making it clear that you want them to continue. I can tell you, I have not known a listener up to this point to break down completely and be unable to stop during the session, if that's what your concern is. Often what you hear will, at least when you first hear it, will feel beyond tears.
What should I do if the vet starts crying?
Just let them cry. Realize that this is probably helpful for them and that they are able to do that because you have made them feel safe.
What if the veteran becomes extremely upset?
Well, it's almost certain that some very upsetting material is going to come up. You may have heard the word triggering used with regard to veterans. Triggering can be used to refer to anything from feeling somewhat upset to having a full-blown flashback, which is when you don't feel like you're having a memory, you feel like you're back there where the terrible thing is happening. But consider this. Our society is so psychiatrized, by which I mean that we put a psychiatric interpretation on everything, that a lot of people, including even some therapists, mistakenly believe that when another person is deeply upset, that there's some technical or magical thing to do that will fix it. Veterans have lived through much intense feeling, and when they've come back, part of what isolates them so much is that too many other people run away from their intensity and pain. So breaking down that isolation is part of what the Welcome Johnny and Jane Home Project is about. Just being with them as they talk about or relive their pain, silently bearing witness, not running from their anguish or telling them that they should be over it by now. You see, far and away the most crucial and powerful thing the listener can do is just continue to be fully present, 100% attentive, and open with your whole heart to what the speaker is saying or what they're feeling if they're not speaking right then. Because this is an eloquent sharing of the burden of the pain that so many have felt in isolation for so long. To some veterans, it means a great deal. To some, it means everything.
If they are upset, should I pat them on the arm or give them a hug?
I recommend against physically touching a veteran during the session, including at a time of greatly intensified feeling. You want to allow them to focus on what they want. So for much the same reason that you don't speak, you don't initiate physical contact. You know what I'm going to say by now. You just listen.
What if the veteran becomes violent?
Well, the media are filled with stories of veterans being violent, and I know that this may be a listener's worst fear. And it's true that the military trains people to attack and kill, so it's understandable to wonder about it. But I can tell you that we've never had a veteran become violent in one of these sessions, although that doesn't mean it will never happen. I suspect that it hasn't happened so far, partly because the listener does not speak, and partly because this is such a safe and quiet setting. The listener speaks only 2 sentences in all, and these are not about war, so the speaker has a huge amount of control over what to say, and when to say it, and when to be silent. So the veteran isn't in a position in which the other person will say something that brings up a bad memory. And you're in a quiet room with no distractions, no passersby, not much likelihood of sudden loud noises. I think the listener's silence makes them feel safer. Beyond that, as several people have said when asked this question, people all over the globe have all through history listened to the stories of those who've returned from war. And it's poignant that even with people who've not been to war, in our society we are often so frightened of each other.
Do I need to understand military lingo? I know I'm not supposed to talk during a listening session, but can I ask a question for clarification if I don't understand what the vet said? You know, for instance, if they use a military term that I don't understand.
No, you don't do anything to guide the direction of the session. This is not about your having or getting specific information. It is about providing the veteran as much freedom as possible to speak or be silent. It's above all not about particular information or facts, but about the deeply human interaction that a listening session is.
What is the second sentence I should say? And when should I say it?
The second sentence that you say has to come well into the session, usually when you have the sense that it's about half over or starting to wind down. And you speak this sentence after 2 things have happened. One is after the vet has told you some very upsetting experience. And the other is after they've told you about something about how it affects them now. And then you speak the following sentence. You say, I'm sure that if I had been through what you described, that like you, I would be having whatever they've said. nightmares or flashbacks, or when a truck backfires, I hit the ground. And I hope you know that's a deeply human reaction. It's not a mental illness, and you're not crazy.
How do I know when the session is over?
We like to leave it to the vet to wind up the session. So far, between about an hour and a half and 2.5 or 3 hours, the vet usually says either I'm ready to stop, or I can't do any more today, or I've done enough. And that's how it ends. Now, if you have to be somewhere, please set aside 3 hours just in case. We've never had one go over 3 hours. And if you have to be somewhere at a certain time, then after about, say, 2 3/4 hours, you can let them know that we have to stop in about 15 minutes.
What if the vet wants to stay in touch with me afterward?
Whether or not you stay in touch with the vet afterward is totally up to you. It's like with any other human relationship.
What if I don't feel comfortable giving out my contact information?
If you want to give them your contact information, that's fine. If you don't feel comfortable, that's okay too.
How are the listeners affected by these sessions?
It's really remarkable. Most of the listeners have said that they started out doing this to do a good deed, to try to help veterans, but that it ended up being, to their surprise, transformative for them. And here's why. They talk about that feeling that this was sacred time because of the integrity and honesty of the veterans. It helps us understand more about humanity and more about our common humanity. And it gives us the chance to form that connection that we otherwise would not have had. And that's very precious.
What if I'm upset afterwards by what I've learned?
It's certainly true that you may never be exactly who you were before. Part of the human condition is to be changed by what we hear, and especially when we have borne witness to someone's pain and anguish. But also, listeners feel gratitude because of the veterans' honesty and integrity. They feel that they've been through something very special, and so the upset is balanced somewhat by those wonderful positive feelings. If you are upset and want to talk with someone who's experienced with this work, we will be glad to do that. It may be someone in your area, or you can also contact me anytime through the website. Remember, too, this perspective. Many people choose to watch films or television shows about real-life events that are upsetting. And so this is kind of like that, except the reality is much more intense. But know that you have done the great service of bearing witness, of sharing some of the pain, and that the veteran knows that and is very likely to be grateful.